The mysterious shoe thief. It started as a joke, a silly, harmless quirk that made everyone in the house laugh. Every morning, without fail, a single shoe would be lying near the front door. At first, the family thought it belonged to one of them, perhaps a slipper that had been left outside by mistake. But when they took a closer look, they realized it wasn't theirs. The first shoe was an old leather loafer, scuffed, slightly worn, but still in decent shape. The next day, a sneaker appeared, then a rugged work boot, and then on the fourth morning, a pair of house slippers. That was when they knew something strange was happening. At first, Emily and her husband, David, laughed it off. "Looks like we've got a shoe thief in the neighborhood," David chuckled, picking up the boot. Emily smirked, nudging their 6-year-old son, Liam. "Are you collecting lost shoes, buddy?" she teased. But Liam shook his head furiously. "It's not me, Mom. I promise." Their teenage daughter, Mia, leaned against the kitchen counter, rolling her eyes. "You guys are missing the obvious," she said. "It's Max." All heads turned toward Max, their playful golden-furred Labrador puppy. At just 8 months old, Max was full of boundless energy, always wagging his tail and chasing after anything that moved. He was mischievous, clever, and had a habit of carrying random things in his mouth. "Max." Emily crouched down, rubbing his ears. "Are you the shoe thief?" Max tilted his head, his big brown eyes blinking innocently. Then, to their complete shock, he trotted over to the corner of the room, where he had stashed 3 more shoes. David burst out laughing. "Well, that solves the mystery." For the first few days, it was a source of endless amusement. Max would disappear in the middle of the night and return with a single shoe, carefully placing it near the door as if it were a gift. Neighbors even started joking about it. "If anyone's missing a shoe, check with Max," they'd say, laughing. But as the days passed, the joke started feeling off. There was a pattern. Max wasn't bringing back just any shoes. They were all men's shoes, and more strangely, they were all the same size. That was when the laughter stopped. A familiar shoe and a growing concern. One morning, after yet another mysterious shoe had appeared, Emily crouched down and examined it carefully. It was old, worn, and covered in dust. But something about it felt familiar. Her fingers traced the edge of the leather, until she spotted a small handcrafted buckle. Her breath caught in her throat. "David," she called, her voice suddenly serious. "Come look at this." David walked over and frowned. "What is it?" Emily swallowed. "This shoe, it belongs to Mr. Harris." David's eyebrows shot up. Mr. Harris was their elderly neighbor. He lived alone in a small old house on the outskirts of the village. He wasn't the most social man, quiet, reserved, always keeping to himself. But he was kind in his own way. Emily had spoken to him a few times, and Liam sometimes waved at him when they walked past his home. But no one had seen Mr. Harris in days. A knot formed in Emily's stomach. Why would Max be bringing back his shoes? Something didn't feel right. David, sensing her unease, nodded. "Let's go return them. Maybe he'll have a good laugh about it." But when they arrived at Mr. Harris's house, the humor quickly faded. An empty house and an open door. Emily and David knocked on the door. No answer. They knocked again. Still nothing. David glanced at Emily, then reached for the door handle. It was unlocked. As the door creaked open, a cold unease washed over them. Inside, the house was silent. Too silent. There was dust on the furniture, unopened mail on the table, and a cup of tea on the counter, long since cold. Emily stepped inside hesitantly. "Mr. Harris," she called. No response. David checked the bedroom. Empty. The kitchen. Empty. The back porch. Empty. But what unsettled them the most was Max's reaction. The playful, energetic puppy had suddenly gone still. His tail wasn't wagging. His ears were perked up. and his body was tense. Then, without warning, he turned and bolted out the door. "Max!" Emily shouted, but he didn't stop. He was running with purpose. Emily and David exchanged a quick glance before chasing after him. And that's when everything changed. A trail to the unknown. Max led them through the quiet village streets, past dimly lit houses, past the old abandoned garden on the outskirts. His small body moved swiftly, his nose low to the ground, following a scent only he could detect. Emily's heart pounded. Where is he taking us? David didn't answer. He just kept running. Max didn't hesitate. He led them straight to an old, dried-up well. A well no one had used in years. And then he stopped. Standing at the edge, Max let out a single loud bark. Emily and David skidded to a halt behind him, breathing hard. The night air was thick with silence. Then they heard it. A sound. A voice. A weak, hoarse whisper coming from the depths of the well. "Help, please." Emily felt the blood drain from her face. David stumbled forward, peering over the edge. And there, at the very bottom of the well, pale and exhausted, was Mr. Harris. His leg was wrapped in a torn piece of cloth. His face was thin and weary. He had been down there for days. And no one had known. No one. Except Max. Emily covered her mouth, her body shaking. Max hadn't been stealing shoes. He had been bringing back Mr. Harris's shoes, trying to tell them something was wrong. Trying to get them to follow him. Trying to save a life. David pulled out his phone with trembling hands. "I'm calling for help," he said. Emily knelt beside Max, hugging him tightly. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Max let out a soft whimper, nuzzling her arm. He had never been stealing. He had been speaking. They had just finally learned how to listen. A hero's call for help. For a moment, Emily and David just stood there, frozen in disbelief. The night was eerily quiet, except for the faint rustling of leaves and the sound of their own heavy breathing. And then that voice again. "Help, please." A weak, broken plea, barely audible, drifting up from the darkness below. Emily's stomach twisted. It was real. This wasn't a mistake. Mr. Harris was down there. Max barked again, his tail stiff, his body poised on the edge of the old well, as if urging them to move faster. David snapped into action. He grabbed his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed emergency services. "Hello, yes, we need help. An elderly man is trapped in a well. We just found him. He's been down there for days. Yes, I think he's injured. Please hurry." Emily dropped to her knees beside the well, peering over the edge. Even in the dim glow of the moonlight, she could see Mr. Harris's frail form. His face was ghostly pale, and his lips were cracked and dry. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle, wrapped hastily in torn cloth. He had been here, alone in the cold, in the dark, with no food or water. For how long? How many nights had he called out, only to be met with silence? Emily's heart ached. And yet, Max had heard him. Max had known before anyone else. She swallowed hard, her voice gentle but urgent. "Mr. Harris, hold on, help is coming." A weak chuckle rose from below, raspy but laced with gratitude. "Knew someone would come," he murmured. "Didn't think it'd be because of a dog." Emily let out a shaky laugh, tears already slipping down her cheeks. "Oh, Mr. Harris," she whispered, "this isn't just any dog." A long, silent battle. The next few minutes felt like hours. Emily and David kept talking to Mr. Harris, asking him questions to keep him awake. His answers were slow, his voice barely more than a whisper, but he was still fighting. Finally, sirens. The distant wail of an approaching ambulance and rescue crew. Max perked up instantly, ears twitching, tail wagging. He ran a few steps toward the flashing lights, then back to the well, as if making sure the rescuers knew exactly where to go. Within seconds, the paramedics and firefighters were surrounding them. A searchlight illuminated the old well, and ropes were secured as a rescuer was lowered down. Emily couldn't take her eyes off the scene. It felt like something out of a movie, a moment so surreal that it didn't seem real. A man who had been alone, forgotten, and on the verge of losing everything, was about to be saved. And all because of Max. David wrapped an arm around Emily's shoulders. "He's going to be okay," he murmured. Emily wiped her face and nodded. "Thanks to Max." David exhaled, glancing down at the little Labrador who sat beside them, ears flicking as he watched every movement carefully. A dog. A puppy. A hero. They didn't deserve him. The moment that changed everything. Minutes later, the rescuer emerged from the well, carrying Mr. Harris. The sight of him, frail, battered, but alive, sent a wave of emotion through the entire group. One of the paramedics immediately rushed forward, helping to secure him on a stretcher, checking his vitals, offering him water. Mr. Harris took a slow, trembling sip. Then, his gaze drifted downward and landed on Max. For a long moment, the two just looked at each other. Man and dog. A silent understanding passing between them. Max, tail wagging ever so slightly, slowly stepped forward. Then, he gently placed his nose against Mr. Harris's hand. A touch, a connection, a thank you. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. Mr. Harris' lips quivered into a small, tired smile. "You," he whispered, "are one smart little guy." Max let out a small, happy whimper and nudged his hand again. And right there, under the glow of flashing emergency lights, everyone realized the weight of what had just happened. Max hadn't just saved a man's life. He had never given up, when everyone else had. More than just a dog. The paramedics prepared Mr. Harris for transport. They assured Emily and David that he would make a full recovery. "He's dehydrated, weak, and his leg is fractured," one of them explained. "But thanks to your dog, we got here just in time." Emily smiled through the tears still glistening in her eyes. "Max knew all along," she whispered. David knelt beside Max, rubbing his fur. "I don't think we'll ever look at you the same way again, buddy." Max just wagged his tail, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just done something extraordinary. To him, he had just followed his heart. The ambulance doors shut with a soft click, and as the vehicle pulled away, Emily felt something deep inside her shift. This wasn't just about saving a life. This was about listening. Sometimes, the world is full of signs, full of silent cries for help, full of unspoken words. And if you're lucky, sometimes you have a friend who understands them before you do. That night, everything changed. When Emily and David returned home, Max didn't sneak out. He didn't bring back another shoe, because his mission was complete. Instead, for the first time in weeks, he curled up in his bed, let out a contented sigh, and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Emily sat beside him, running her fingers through his soft fur. "Good boy, Max," she whispered, and even though he was half asleep, his tail wagged. Because he knew. He had done something that no one else could, and he didn't need to steal another shoe ever again. The unseen bond that saves lives. The house was unusually quiet the next morning. The usual bustle of breakfast preparations, Liam's giggles, and Max's playful barks were replaced with a soft, reflective silence. Emily sat at the kitchen table, staring at her cup of coffee, watching as the steam curled into the air. Her mind was still replaying the events of the previous night. How had Max known? How had he sensed something no human had? How had he understood what they couldn't? A soft nudge against her knee pulled her out of her thoughts. She looked down and saw Max sitting beside her, his golden eyes full of warmth, his tail wagging softly against the floor. "Good morning, hero," she murmured, running a gentle hand through his fur. Max leaned into her touch, then looked toward the front door. A knock echoed through the house. Emily glanced at David, who was already rising from his chair. When he opened the door, they weren't surprised to see two uniformed officers standing there, alongside a man they had thought they might never see again, Mr. Harris. An emotional reunion. Mr. Harris looked so much better than the night before. His skin still looked pale, his posture slightly weaker, but there was a renewed light in his eyes, a spark that hadn't been there before. A deep, quiet gratitude. Emily's heart clenched as she stepped forward. "Mr. Harris," she breathed. "You're up and moving." The elderly man chuckled, gripping his cane tightly. "I have your dog to thank for that," he said, his voice still hoarse but filled with sincerity. Max, sitting obediently beside Emily, wagged his tail. Mr. Harris looked down at him, a small smile forming on his lips. "I always knew dogs were loyal," he said, his eyes misty. "But I never thought one would save my life." The officer standing beside him, a kind-looking man with a badge that read Sergeant Miller, cleared his throat. "We just wanted to stop by and let you know how incredible this dog is," he said. "The paramedics told us that if he hadn't led you to that well, let's just say Mr. Harris might not be here today." Emily swallowed hard, tears threatening to spill. David rested a hand on Max's head, his voice thick with emotion. "We always knew he was special," he murmured, "but we never imagined this." Mr. Harris crouched as best as he could, his old joints creaking, and reached out a trembling hand. Max didn't hesitate. A hero's legacy. The days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after something so extraordinary. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day. Mr. Harris was doing well. The bruises had faded, his leg was healing, and his strength was returning. The town had come together to support him, bringing him home-cooked meals, helping repair his house, and making sure he was never alone. But the person, or rather, the soul, who never left his side was Max. Every morning, without fail, Max would trot over to Mr. Harris's house, sit patiently on his porch, and wait for the door to open. And every morning, Mr. Harris would chuckle, open the door, and greet him with the same words. "Well, come on in then, hero." And just like that, Max had two homes. The unbreakable bond. One late afternoon, Emily, David, and the kids decided to visit Mr. Harris. They found him sitting in his rocking chair, a book resting in his lap, and Max lying at his feet, dozing peacefully. Liam skipped ahead, plopping down beside Max. "He's your dog now too, huh, Mr. Harris?" he asked with a grin. The old man smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Oh, I wouldn't say that. I think I belong to him." Everyone laughed, but deep down, they knew it was true. Max had chosen him, just like he had chosen to save him. Some connections are beyond explanation. Some love is written in ways humans can't fully understand. A small gesture, a big meaning. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in warm golden hues, Emily pulled something from her bag. It was an old, worn-out shoe. Mr. Harris blinked in surprise. "You kept it?" he asked, his voice soft. Emily smiled. "It's a reminder," she said, "that sometimes, even the smallest things, the things we don't think twice about, can lead to something life-changing." She set the shoe down beside Max. The dog opened his eyes, glanced at it, and gently placed his paw on top. A silent acknowledgement. A quiet tribute. Mr. Harris's eyes glistened. The shoe that started it all. The message Max had been trying to send. Now it was a symbol of love, of loyalty, of life itself. The final lesson. As they walked back home, David exhaled deeply. "It's funny," he said. "We always thought Max was just being playful, when all along he was trying to tell us something important." Emily nodded. "We didn't listen at first, but he never gave up." David smiled, looking down at Max trotting beside them. "No," he said. He didn't. Liam, walking ahead, turned back and beamed. "Because he's a hero." Max wagged his tail in agreement, and in that moment, they all understood something profound. It's easy to ignore the little signs in life, to overlook the details, to dismiss things as coincidence. But sometimes the greatest messages come in the quietest ways. A paw on a shoe, a bark in the night, a love so pure it refuses to be unheard. Max had never needed words. He had simply known, and because of him, a life was saved. And a bond, a friendship that transcended time, was born.